Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers that are interested in composition. French harmony exercises is for anyone who wants to go back to basics. I had to move to Paris, France, and I stayed there for 5 years to properly learn harmony. With this excellent training in harmony in the French style, I was able to reorchestrate my first symphony, help us on the way for orchestra without needing any teacher or outside assistance. I was also able to compose my first fugue, the Visage Odieux for men's chorus, also without needing a teacher or extra assistance. If you are struggling with orchestration or fugue, or maybe composition in general, I highly urge you to make the long-term investment and to attack it at the source and master basic harmony. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you the most essential information for rules for root position chords. Let's begin. The French method to mastering basic harmony. In France, you're going to be writing above and below. So you'll be given a soprano line, and you'll have to hear the bass line, and then of course hear the middle voices, so the alto and the tenor. Or you'll be given the bass line, and you'll have to hear the soprano line, and then of course you'll have to hear the tenor and the alto. This becomes super important the more you advance in your studies. So for example, when you orchestrate, right, you have a tutti chord, climax, or just any chord, right? You're going to have to get those outer distances. You have to figure out where is the bass placed, which octave. You're going to probably have to double the bass. So that's something that comes from harmony. You're going to have to choose the top of the chord, is it on the third, the fifth, all of that. And you're going to have to fill in those voices. Many times the French horns come to save you, sometimes the trombones or the violas. So this all comes from harmony studies. In addition, when you do fugue, though a lot of times the subject is, it's predetermined, so it's going to top voice, middle voice, there are many times where you still have to think about what the top voice is going to be because it's a relationship to the bass. If it's very boring or muddy, the listener is going to perceive that. So even if the top voice isn't the main melody, you still will have to think about pleasurable intervals against the bass, which comes from harmony. Another thing is étude de style. So that's kind of like the top, the cream of the crop, the top of the top with harmony studies. And you'll be doing étude de style de Mozart, for example. So you'll be doing string quartets in the style of Mozart. You'll be provided the violin 1 line, and you'll have to hear the cello as well as the viola, as well as the violin 2. So we have the soprano, we have the bass, and then we have the tenor and the alto here. Or the other way around. You'll provide the bass, so the cello, and then you'll have to hear the soprano, the violin 1, and the middle voices. So the alto, which would be the violin 2, or the tenor, which here is the viola. So this is all coming from harmony. So if you want to go deeper with any of the studies I've talked about on this channel that are part of the French method, then it would be very wise to understand how it actually works. Go to the source, which is the bass to soprano relationship. One other thing I should mention is when you do étude de style, for example, in Mozart, so if you have that cello line, you're going to have to infer from that line, like what is the melody? You have to study it. You can't just randomly make anything up. So once you get to that, you're going to have to look for a lot of clues, and you need harmony to be in really good order. Now let's talk about root position chords. So many of you probably have done some harmony and are clearly quite dissatisfied, as I was. I had to move to France, but hopefully you won't have to move to France. There's other options now. But maybe if you're coming from America, it was introduced in college and you were provided like the soprano from a Bach chorale or the bass, the figured bass, and then you had to do the exercise. That is obscenely difficult, and also it takes a ridiculous amount of time. To do something excellent, I don't think you can even do it in one sitting unless you have 6 to 8 hours. Really. Okay, it takes a very long time. What also makes it difficult is these Bach chorales that they're using to learn harmony, they have modulations, they have suspensions. They don't usually have sequences in them. There's cadences, there's, note de passage, or I don't know how you call it in English, but you have all these things that make the exercise much more difficult. So in harmony in the French style, we go to the pure basics. We go to root position chords. So for your ego, it may seem like, what group? But it's so we can iron everything out in advance. Now, it's really basic, but it's very difficult. Now, one thing to mention is when you do root position chords and you go on to first inversion, you may not have mastered root position chords. That's okay. All right. I'll talk about later, like what needs to be mastered. That's okay because you're still learning. And it's something you may want to revisit later on, which I'll talk about in a couple of seconds. So for root position chords, when it comes to minor keys, there's only 4 keys allowed because the other keys are either dissonant or they're used for modulations. So that means only 4 choices. It's life and death. There's only one is the best option. So I know it's really frustrating, but if you can put a lot of energy into just doing a good job for these exercises, it becomes easier and easier. It will always feel hard because the easier it gets, just your standards keep rising. I just want to warn you. For major keys, there are 6 chords that are allowed, and what you're seeing is everything is exposed in harmony. That's the beauty of the French method, is we see everything, we see all the deficiencies in your technique so that we can directly attack at the source, so that when you do orchestration fugue or your own compositions, it just feels like freedom. One quick mention is do not try to apply what you're learning in these studies. Just do the study separately from composition, then compose. Don't try to faut pas mélanger les deux. Don't try to mix the two because you'll probably misapply. Now, as I mentioned, you may at some point want to revisit root position chords after, they say, maybe you've gone to the dominant 7th chord, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this episode. Just to share my experiences, so I think once I got to the dominant 7th chords, a little bit afterwards, I did revisit the root position chords both in the Chalon as the Renault, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and what I found, it was much harder. The reason why it's much harder is my standards had risen, so I had clear ideas of what is a good bass line, what is a good soprano line, and when you first do it the first time around, you don't really know, so it's just you try to get to the end. But as your standards rise, like, oh my goodness, root position chords are really difficult. Another thing that will come into play the second time you do root position chords is the doublings. So the first time around, you're only doubling what you have to, but the second time around, you start experimenting, where can I double the third? Now we're going to talk about first inversion chords. So you'll have root position chords, and then we'll add first inversions to it. So we're it's these building blocks, which is why you got to start the work now, so that when we get to first inversion, that you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning. Now, something to mention is we're doing root position chords right now, but I'm looking as early as fall 2026 or the latest winter 2027 is bringing in first inversion chords. So if you want to do a harmony, you see it's necessary, I highly recommend doing the exercises now, even if it's just a little bit. It has to be done, I would say, 2 to 3 times per week, so it's not always just starting from the beginning. But you cannot skip this step, because once we get to first inversion chords, that will be my priority. I'll be doing more videos just on first inversion chords. It'll be very live and very exciting, but if you try to do the exercises, there's going to be a lot of gaps and deficiencies, and ultimately you will still have to go back to root position chords. So work on root position chords on a regular basis. If you cannot do, at least I think 3 hours a week you're going to need if you really want to, and it has to be quality. Cell phone's got to be off, handwritten, maximum quality, okay? If you do not put quality into the exercise, you can't use that skill for fugue and orchestration. No one wants a mediocre fugue. No one wants half okay orchestration. One of the best of the best of the best comes through dressing directly for harmony studies. A very important analogy I want to share with you. So think about the difference between learning about driving a car, so reading about it, maybe even watching videos, and then driving the car. 2 very different experiences. That's what I'm talking about with harmony. So intellectual knowledge, watching a video, great. Watching the shorts, great. But you need to actually do the work. You have to download the exercises. They're up on school as well as my website, and you have to do the work. An example I can give is, for a long time, I wasn't good at parallel parking, okay? And then one time I was living in a city where I couldn't get parking unless I did parallel parking. So because I was forced to, and I actually did it, I actually feel comfortable now doing parallel parking. So the same thing with harmony. To get better at it, you have to do the work. Now let's talk about second inversion chords. So when it comes to second inversion chords, I would say on n'ajoute pas grand chose, we say in French. It doesn't add that much more. The big thing is the expanded use of the cadences. So going back to first inversion chords, be ready, it's coming. So get those root position chords down ASAP, all right? So first inversion chords, there are a lot of doubling options, all right? So the 6 is going to be the most common, but many cases it's not going to be. The third is sometimes what's best. The third of a 6 chord is the root position chords, the dominant. Okay, it's 5. The bass is less common, I would say, except for certain chord progressions. So you're seeing a trend here. There's rules, but there's exceptions. So you have to do it to experience it for yourself. And I would say the beauty of first inversion chords is your first real choice in doublings. So for root position chords, you don't really have a choice. You double the root, you double the root, you double the root. The big exception is for the deceptive cadence, in which you're going to double the third. Okay, there's one tiny exception for major keys, which is on the rules for root position chords, but in general, it's going to be double the root, or for the deceptive cadence, you double the third. So you don't really have any choice. For the more advanced root position chord exercises, you will do strategic doubling of the third, which I will show you at the end of this video, at the very end, an example where you do have a strategic doubling of the third, but that's more advanced. So when it comes to first inversion chords, and then we'll go back to second inversion chords. First inversion chords, there's just a lot to do. So we have doubling the 6, which I said is the most common. We have a lot of formulas you have to learn, and they speed track. Like if you don't know the formulas, and it's gonna take way too long. You will have to learn the formulas here. Okay. So for example, descending leaps of thirds in the soprano have certain formulas, particularly certain chord progressions. Also, you will learn voice exchange. I've tried to already introduce this with the more advanced root position chords exercise to get you ready, but we'll go in full for first inversion chords. You'll also get introduced to new types of cadences. So we'll have the 5-6-1. It's an imperfect authentic cadence. For root position chords, we have the imperfect authentic cadence, which is also a 5-1, but usually the third is going to be placed in the soprano for the 1. But when we get to first inversion chords, we'll have another type of imperfect authentic cadence where we have the leading tone in the bass that goes up to the tonic. Now be careful of intellectual knowledge, because you probably heard imperfect authentic cadence, and to your mind, they're somehow related. They're not, okay, are barely related. They are very, very differently used, and this is why you have to master as much as you can, or just do a really good job with root position chords. I have a lot of imperfect authentic cadence kind of trying to prepare you, all right, so that when you get to first inversion chords, you don't get tricked by the intellectual language language is often inaccurate or insufficient, and that you have the experience of doing it by the hand. Okay, and one quick mention is all these exercises need to be done by hand. You copy them by hand, and they have to be completed by hand. That's the best learning. When you do on a computer, it's shallow. You use the sound of the computer, which deadens your ears. It's easy to erase. You don't see all your work. The one exception, of course, if you don't have hands, you have a true medical disability. But otherwise, they absolutely, there is no discussion. It must be done by hand. Now we have a new chord that gets introduced for first inversion chords, which is the Neapolitan 6. The Neapolitan 6 is quite difficult to hear because sometimes that lowered second, you're not going to see it in the soprano or the bass, so you're going to have to really hear it. But once you kind of start to able to hear it, you won't be able to unhear it, and you'll just have a richer ear because of it. Now, for first inversion chords, and we'll get back to second inversion chords, but I hope you're seeing first inversion chords, there is a lot to do. There is a lot of work. So that means you want the root position chords. You want to be competent. You don't have to master it, but you have to know what you're doing. And that means you have to be doing the exercises. It's not something you can do last minute. You can study for a test last minute, right? AI can do it for you, right? You don't even need to study for a test. But harmony, you can only gain the skill by doing it. It's just like driving a car. It's only by doing it and crashing the car. But here, luckily, there's not as much of a danger. So, doubling opportunities. Like I said, the 6 is doubled very often. The third, which is like the fifth of the root position chords, we're going to double the third sometimes to avoid parallel fifths. Now, quick mention on parallel fifths. The French, there are two understandings of parallel fifths when it comes to first inversion chords. Getting back on track, you will also learn the poor voicing of a sixth chord. This creates a very rough effect. It's something that you will probably make the mistake at first, but by doing the work and hearing and getting those corrections through these tutorials like this, all right, and I am building some programs directly on School that will be more individualized. Some will be open, some will be paid, okay? Now, another thing for first inversion chords is you're going to be doubling the bass sometimes. Usually not, but sometimes you do. All right. So for cadential chords, especially, for example, the 2/6. So for a 2/6, it is almost always a cadential chord, so it helps prepare the cadence. Then we go to the 5 and go to the 1. And you're going to double the subdominant degree. So if we're in A minor, the subdominant is D. So we're doubling the bass of the 2/6, and that's going to be DD, all right? So this is really where the harmony is directly training you for really to have just an amazing ear. So let me play another version. And let me play a less good version. So notice that one sounds more depressed and one sounds more alive. If you can't hear the difference, it's okay. Play a piano when you have time, or it takes time. I wasn't consciously aware of these differences until I just did many, many exercises, and later I just noticed, oh, there is a difference. It's not the same. One of the benefits of this kind of training, though officially you're focused on getting the outer voices, getting the middle voice, you're so focused on the balance, all right, and solving the exercise, it actually gets you a really sharp ear. So when I went to reorchestrate my first symphony, How Wasn't Ready for Orchestra, I was able to hear it much more acutely. There were still things I couldn't hear as much as I wanted to, but I was able to hear, I want more fifth in this chord. I need less fifth. Like I had all this nuance, as they say in French. Now, getting back to second inversion chords, I would say it's not that much is added. The first inversion chords, there's so many possibilities and things to think about, and still there's usually only one or two good options. All right, so it's going to take a lot of time. You got to do the reposition chords. You gotta be ready. So download those exercises. Just start it. Okay, just a little bit every day, or choose 3 times per week. But it's got to be integrity. Handwritten, unless you have medical disability. You got to sing through the exercises. You can't have your cell phone on. You can't be texting in the background. It's got to be committed. I want to master this, and then hopefully you'll be ready when I start doing first inversion chords tutorials possibly as soon as this fall. Now, for second inversion chords, I think the big contribution is the cadential 6/4. The cadential 6/4 is going to expand the duration of a cadence. This is super important when it comes to orchestration or fugue because obviously cadences tend to be a little bit longer. You tend to have more instruments. Definitely when you orchestrate in the style of Mozart, you might bring in the woodwinds as a commentary for the cadence. It really depends. But the cadential 6/4, on ouvre les voies, we say in French, it just expands the possibilities. The cadential 6/4 can also be thought of as a suspension. Now, depending, it's not always prepared like a suspension, but the 6 and the 4, there are dissonants over the bass in this case, and they resolve to a 5 5-3. So the resolution of the 6-4 to the 5-3 is also preparing you for fugue, okay, for in terms of suspensions. A really important thing I want to mention with harmony is that harmony allows you to manipulate time. What do you? Okay, so if you've ever tried to study Mozart, all right, you may have been shocked to discover that sometimes not repeats, okay, despite the fact that it sounds very regular and maybe predictable, one could say, but just was very even, very symmetrical. If you actually look at the phrasing, there'll be like 3.5 measures, there'll be 5 measures. It's not just 2 and 2 and 4 and 4. Over time, maybe it will add up to that, but you'll just see that it's just a little bit weird. But the reason he's able to do that is through harmony. So yes, the end goal of harmony studies is liberation. But another way we can think of it is when you master basic harmony, you will be able to manipulate time. Now let's talk about modulations and sequences. So you may have seen me discuss in previous tutorials the difference between Renaud and Henri Chalon, right? I hope to do maybe a separate video at some point, really breaking it down for those of you who are curious. But those are the two harmony textbooks, workbooks that I use when I was in France. And I think most composers, if you train in France, you'll either do the Henri Chalon or you'll do the Renaud. So the Henri Chalon, I highly recommend for those on this channel. Like, you may be super like amazing as a composer, as a violinist, you have a career, or you're really good, but you recognize that gaps in your training are preventing you from reaching the highest echelon. So you want to address it directly at the source, which is going to be in harmony. So Henri Chalon, which is what I started out on, is just chords, 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 just chords, chords, just chords. All right? Versus the Renaud is, at first it's chords, but very quickly he starts to like these little minuets, little pieces. Okay, so it's much more musical focused. The Renaud is more like a musical puzzle, kind of like doing Sudoku puzzles, except but for music. The Renaud is ridiculously difficult, so it can crush your ego, and I think it can be a detriment for certain people who are just trying to learn. It's really, really difficult, versus the Chalon is just much more manageable. So we're going to focus more on the Chalon, but at some point we might expand to the Renaud if some of you really get a higher level. Now the Henri Chalon, he does root position, first inversion, second inversion, book 1. Book 2, he brings in modulations and sequences, and then you're working with all of them, first inversion, second inversion, root position, all at the same time. Versus the Renaud, he has the first kind of workbook. Page 1 is root position chords, and I think that's it. Maybe there's 2 pages, and then he moves on, and very quickly he brings in suspensions. So there's different methods of how to teach harmony. The Renaud is definitely very difficult. I actually am taking a position here on Compositions Allies. We will not be following Henri Chalon. Right? I think things need to be adapted. So Henri Chalon is in a system, I think he's dead now, but we're in a system where there is a harmony teacher in every town, or it's very easy to get harmony lessons, very affordable. And we're living in a time where we can't all go to France to get this training. So I know a lot of you already have some harmony training, but you need to go back to basics, but you want to get ready in a more concerted fashion for orchestration and fugue. So modulations will get you there much quicker. You still have to do, it will be harder, but I understand for some of you, it's really frustrating to not have the modulation sequences. So I have 2 sets of exercises right now for position chords. I have non-modulating exercises and then more advanced ones that are modulations and sequences. So non-modulating exercises, these are for first-time users. Okay, anyone just new to the whole shebang. Okay, I have a G minor exercise that should be gérable. This is in French, it should be manageable, right? And the goal of these entry-level exercises, okay, is to just learn the patterns. For example, there's a plagal cadence. Listen to the soprano. Hear the realization. So these non-modulating entry-level exercises are designed just to get you ready. Then we have harder exercises. So we have a D minor exercise. So soprano leaps an octave, or we have harmony of the dominant, and there is a high risk of parallel octaves. We also have voicing cross phrases. So even though this is root position chords, it still is really, really difficult, and it's not supposed to be easy. We're trying to train you so you have that flexibility, so when you do orchestration or fugue, or even just like long-term for your compositions, that you can just hear what you want, you can grab what you want, you can realize it. It doesn't mean that things come effortlessly, but it means you're able to do it without needing a teacher and without needing to accept a mediocre result. Now for the modulating exercises, this is, like I mentioned, is specifically targeted for those of you who are trying to do orchestration and fugue. So the modulating exercises are really going to get you to hear harmonically. So smooth key changes versus abrupt key changes, right? When you're voicing a key change, you want it to be convincing and you want it to be as smooth as possible. Another thing you'll have to do is to hear the modulation itself. So when you try to do the voice exercise, you may not see accidentals in the soprano or the bass. You'll have the chiffre, we say, we'll have the figures. But in soprano, you may not see accidentals, so you're really going to have to listen harmonically. For example, in the A minor soprano exercise that we recently did, we talked about how if you're hearing melodically, it sounds like it's in C major. But when you actually do a diagnosis and try to solve it, at some point you'll realize a lot of it is in fact in A minor. Some of the other skills that you're going to get along the way is how to get back to the home key, right? When you're doing a modulation, you want to be convincing. One of the dangers with fugue, sometimes composers, they want to get back to the next section, they want to wrap up the fugue, they want to get to the new section, but it feels too abrupt. Or even if it doesn't feel too abrupt, the change does not feel convincing for the listener. This is addressed directly in harmony studies. Another thing you will learn through the modulation exercises, and this is just root position chords, okay, so it should be manageable if you start from the very beginning, is you'll learn the many different flavors of the cadences. So we have cadences, which we'll go over in part 2 of this video, but you're going to hear the cadences in different keys. So it's one thing to hear the cadences in one key, but you're going to have to listen in other keys. So it's really, when you try to search for new material, when you just compose, you're going to have a lot more options on the table. Another thing to mention, like I mentioned, do not try to mix composition with the study. So when you go to compose your own music or orchestrate or do your own fugue, if you try to apply what you're learning, you'll misapply. Okay, you'll misapply because you're still in the middle of learning, still in the middle of mastering, and your music will be really safe, right? Because we have rules about parallel fifths, which we'll talk about in the second part 2 of this video, but that is for a specific study for a specific reason. If you try to compose music and you say, oh, I can't do music, it's not going to be nice music. It's not going to be your authentic style. So just make sure you do an investment here to get that harmonic ear, that training, but don't try to mix it. Don't try to mix it with composition because you will just pollute the two. Another important skill you're going to learn through these modulations is when to make adjustments. So I will talk about more in part 2 of this video, that generally you want the voices to move as little as possible. There's a lot of exceptions to that, especially for the soprano, which is why you have to do the exercises on a regular basis. So it's not intellectual knowledge, it's actually you have experience. We can see you can drive the car versus talk about driving the car. So some of the decisions you're going to have to figure out, especially if you're a bass exercise, is where does the soprano make adjustments? Where is it going to do leaps? Where is it going to change elevation? This is very common after a cadence, especially after a key change. So this exercise, notice how we have that key change, it's confirmed, we have the cadence, and then after the fermata, I readjust the voices. Another thing you will find is when there's large leaps in the soprano, you're going to have to utilize the alto and the tenor to rebalance the chord. Let's talk about the dominant seventh chord. So we talked about root position chords. It's happening now. I'm doing tutorials maybe every week and a half, every 2 weeks. There's also shorts that come through a couple times a week. So it's happening now. You can do the work now. Just find the time to do it so it's while it's happening live. Download the exercise either on my website or on school.com/composition and just start learning it now. Because then we're going to get to first inversion, which is coming very soon. And I'm actually thinking I'm going to combine second inversion with first inversion. So we're going to do first inversion chords, and then at a certain moment, I will bring in second inversion because there's not that much more that it has to add. And then we'll have year 3 of the program, we can get to the dominant seventh chord. So there's a lot of work coming ahead if you want to be a part of it and get better harmony without a teacher. Let's talk quickly about modulations and sequences. So this is a kind of harder level for each stage. So for root position chords, we have root position chords, non-modulating, and then we bring in modulations and sequences. So it really gets you ready for orchestration and fugue. So I'm currently creating a levels chart, right? It's in the process of making, so better able when you come to this channel to figure out what exercise is adapted for your level. All right, so to start, we have the absolute beginner for root position chords. So for example, the soprano exercise in G minor, you'll notice the soprano, on ne bouge pas, okay, on presque rien, we say in French, it barely moves at all. So it allows you to focus on just the bass without having to worry about, these crazy voicings with middle voices. We also have the bass exercises. Now for the bass exercise, you already know the harmony. So the soprano will have to leap, otherwise you just place the soprano and it basically just does itself, but there won't be any unconventional spacing. This can't last forever, of course, because to actually be ready for orchestration fugue, you need to have this more unconventional spacing, but these basic beginner exercises allow you to work on that much quicker. Now I also have harder level exercises on my website. So I have a B minor exercise. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but notice how I have a doubled third. We'll talk about why I have to do this. We also have voice exchange. Let's talk about why the dominant seventh chord is so important. So if you do orchestration in the French style, at some point you're going to have Mozart, orchestrating style of Mozart, and obviously the dominant seventh chord is part of his vocabulary. There's going to be different resolutions, incomplete versus complete. There's also going to be a lot of options for the spacing and the voicing of the chord, and you'll have to choose the best one. So for example, for third inversion chords, where the seventh of the chord is placed in the bass, notice that we had 3 very, very different options, and of course it depends what's going on in fuller context, but it's going to take a lot of time to just voice them correctly, to sense what is the best voicing. It will take time, so that's why you can do root position now. You got to be ready so that when it's happening live, it's actually happening, you can be part of it and you can grow. Or maybe you will have figured out harmony on your own or gotten a teacher or something else. But if you want to be part of it long term, we are building to the dominant seventh chord. Now for dominant seventh chords, we have traditional use and non-traditional use. So the traditional use, or actually it's called exceptional use in French. I have to figure out a way to translate it. But traditional use means it's a 5-to-1, and a non-traditional or exceptional use would be for modulations. A really important thing to understand is that in the French understanding of harmony, the fully diminished seventh chord is actually understood as a ninth chord on the dominant, but without the dominant present. We call that son fondamental. So in other words, if we're in C minor, we have B natural, D, F, A flat, but the G is the true root of the chord, is just temporarily absent. So the reason I mention that is when you get to the fully diminished seventh chord, if you want to do it, you need to have a really good understanding not intellectual, but experiential understanding of the dominant seventh chord. Another thing to mention is that for Wagner, the prelude to Tristan and Isolde, he has all these these diminished chords that just they modulate so flexibly. Well, obviously this comes from a deep understanding, experiential, of harmony. Now in part 2, we're going to talk about the most essential information that you're going to need to really get down to action. And of course, watching the video may be nice, watching the shorts may be nice, but you have to do the work. You have to do the work. You have to download the exercises, and you have to do the work. And it takes a lot of time. And if you're just rushing through to get to the end, that is not something you can use. If you rush through this and don't do quality, you cannot cash in on that success later on, because that's not something we want to hear. We don't want a fugue that is half there, or orchestration that's half there. We want the best that you can do, and that comes from doing the best already in your harmony exercises. A big announcement: I now have rules for root position chords up on school.com/composition. You go to the website, you click on classroom, and then you can sign up for free and you can access the rules. All right. These rules took me maybe 6 months to put in motion, though I didn't always work on it every single day or every single week, but it took me about 6 months' time. So what I did is I looked at the critical French harmony books to, find out what was in common in all of them, and I reviewed them and I revised them. My principal books were the Dubois, which is what Nadia Boulanger used for her students, and which was like a critical book in France for a very long time, and the Bernaud. Okay, Alain Bernaud was a professor at the Paris Conservatory. If you were to study in Paris right now, many of the teachers at the Paris Conservatory or throughout the regional conservatories who are a little bit older, maybe in their 50s, maybe in their 60s, they were trained by Bernaud directly. Unfortunately, his textbook has not been officially printed, as I know, and it's also in French. So I went through the Dubois and some other French books and just took out what was the most essential, and maybe in a future video I'll explain what I had to cut and why. So this professional level short series is up on school. You can access it right now to get all the rules, okay? So we have 3 parts to it. We have part 1, which is the absolute rules: no parallel fifths, no parallel octaves, all those essential rules. There's no way you can complete the exercise unless you know the absolute rules. Double check it even if you already have experience of harmony. Part 2 is general rules, so that's focused more on voice leading and doubling. And part 3 is exceptions. Exceptions is really important because some of these you may not know if you haven't done harmony in the French style. And some of these exceptions, one of the ways I figured them out, I didn't see them mentioned in the harmony textbooks, but I had to do tutorials to figure out like what was missing from some of these books. So I don't even know if you can find it, if you can even read French. Now we're going to talk about cadences of root position chords. So the first 2 things that you do when you get a harmony exercise is you have to write it by hand. It has to be written by hand. It has to be written by hand. Okay. When you do things in the computer, it's very shallow work. You're going to use the computer sound to guide you. It's going to deaden your ears, and then you, instead of erasing or recopying the exercise, you're just going to replace it, and you're not going to see your work. This is not a usable skill when we get to orchestration or fugue, where we have to see the work and we have to make decisions. Do I want to recopy or not? Of course, an exception is if you don't have hands or you have some physical ailment and you can't do it, you're going to have to find a suitable alternative. After you copy the exercise by hand, you're going to have to sing through the exercise. This is so you hear the harmonic potential. Then once you're done that preparatory work, one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to listen for the cadences. So there are 5 essential cadences for root position chords. I have a professional level short series on my website. It is subtitled. Many of you have seen the shorts coming through on YouTube Shorts, but it is up on my website. But I will just briefly review each of the cadences. So we have the perfect authentic cadence, and this is for ending a piece. So for example, we have a 5-1. We have the leading tone, it has to be in the soprano. Then we have the plagal cadence. So it is used for ending the piece typically, though it can happen prior, and it's a 4-1. It's a more relaxing ending, and there's going to be a formula frequently associated with it. So when you have a 6-4-1, you'll see tonic, tonic, tonic in a soprano. Then we're going to have a half cadence. So a half cadence is a pause on a 5 chord. It is frequently used to divide the exercises into two parts. It is especially important for fugue because in fugues, you're going to have to be, ridiculously comfortable with cadences because you're going to have to work on the proportions of your fugues. The exposition isn't too long or too short. And one of the ways you can most aggressively work on this is through the duration of the cadences. We have the deceptive cadence. The deceptive cadence is a 5/6 progression. Rules are super clear. Double the third, double the third, double the third. The most common destination after a 5 is to go to 6. So if you're on a half cadence, then you go to 6, which forms a deceptive cadence. Many times a deceptive cadence is going to be followed by the 4. Therefore, if you're not doing the exercises on a regular basis and you're doing it for yourself, all you have is intellectual knowledge. It's not something you can actually utilize later on. So you have to do the work. We have the imperfect authentic cadence. Now this is used to replace the deceptive cadence or the perfect authentic cadence. This keeps the motion going. I find that a lot of composers and performers are actually less familiar with the imperfect authentic cadence in root position chords, maybe because they've done so much Bach, where there is already, we have modulations, we have first inversion, second inversion, but when it comes to root position, many times the imperfect authentic cadence is going to be your only option if you want to keep the motion going. Now, just as a reminder, if you want just the in-depth information, go to my website, barngmusic.com/fundamentals of harmony. Go to there's 6 shorts up there, complete, very accurate information, slow speaking voice. There's some good sound samples, and you will be able to get the information you need. But of course, you need to actually do the work. You have to download the exercises and copy them in hand and complete them if you have a physical ailment. Let's talk about finding the cadences in this new B minor exercise. So this is a model exercise I just made just so it's easier to go over concepts. We're not going to focus too much on strategy in this video because I want to overlay the most essential things, but we will do a little bit of strategy. So the deceptive cadence. Then we have an imperfect authentic cadence. Remember that many times for an imperfect authentic cadence, we're going to place the third and soprano for the 1 for root position chords. Notice that we don't have any perfect authentic cadence because we're ending for plagal cadence. We'll get to it in a second. However, I want to mention that for modulations, you will encounter perfect authentic cadence in the new key. This is great for marking the form. For example, in Bach fugues, at the end of the exposition, what will happen? You'll have a perfect authentic cadence in the new key, often the dominant or the relative. Doesn't have to be, but many times you'll find this to be the case. However, we definitely do not want a perfect authentic cadence in the home key until the end of the exercise. Again, do not try to mix this with composition because obviously if you look at any Mozart symphony, you see plenty of perfect authentic cadences throughout the piece. So that's on a much larger scale. So just think locally, just think about the harmony exercise. You can't have a perfect authentic cadence in the home key until you get to the end of the exercise. We have the half cadence. And we have plagal cadence. So we have the ending. And notice actually in the beginning there is a plagal cadence. It is still a plagal cadence, but really when we're thinking of plagal cadences, we're usually talking about the ending. Now let's talk about phrases for root position chords. So one of the principal ideas you want to think about is the path of least resistance. I go into a lot more detail on this on school.com/composition. If you go to Classroom, join for free, and you go to the rules for root position chords, part B is going to be the general rules. So as a reminder, part A is the absolute rules, part C are the exceptions, which is actually will pertain to the path of least resistance, but part B is going to be general rules like doubling and general voice leading. And so the path of least resistance states that, in general, voices should move as little as possible. There are a lot of exceptions to this, but the general norm is there's kind of a scale-like motion or as little leap as possible, but there are exceptions. So we have the alto. And notice that its line is a little boring, but this is very common for a middle voice, plus it's the root position chords. There's not many options. Now we have the tenor. Notice the tenor moves very little. Just to experience it, let's hear alto and tenor together. So one thing I highly recommend, I haven't done a video yet on this, I don't think I've mentioned it before, maybe because I think it's so obvious, but I want to actually start adding this to the list of things that you might want to do, is to sing the parts when you've completed the exercise, okay? Especially, you can mix up the parts, playing piano, maybe I'll do it in a future video, but I would say actually singing and playing the middle parts, because they're less noticed, because we're focused on the outer voices a lot, and then usually we just fill in the middle voices and then we're hopefully done. But the middle voices have certain tendencies that you want to bring. So for example, we have the alto. Fa, sol, sol, mi, sol, fa, sol, fa, sol, fa, fa, re, sol, fa. First thing I noticed just by singing the alto line without the harmony is that resonance of the 5. It just feels like it's just, there's this feeling of the 5. And now, of course, we have to hear the harmony, but this is why you sing, because you want that built-in harmonic potential kind of reaching you. One thing to notice is, notice that leap of a third. Fa, sol, fa, fa, re, fa, re. When I see this for root position chords exercise, immediately I'm thinking this has to be a deceptive cadence. Okay, how do I know that? I've done exercises now that I see patterns. This is why we sing afterwards, to start noticing those patterns. Now we have the tenor. Si, 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 sol, si, si, la, si, 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 la, si, 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 la, si, mi, re. All right, so again, notice it has a lot of repetition, so that's part of these middle voices, it's part of the natures. A little pro tip is sometimes you'll find that if you do wider spacing, the voice leading won't really change, just the voices get flipped. It's a little bit too advanced, but some of you will understand what I'm talking about. So one thing to notice with the tenor is that it goes si, la, si, right? It leading to the tonic. So if this were in the soprano, it would kill the piece every time, so it's tucked away in the middle voice. Let's talk about leaps of a fourth in alto and tenor. So notice that the voicing of deceptive cadence, it brings the middle voices away from the soprano, so a lot of times they're going to leap, and they're going to leap a fourth. This may not be intuitive, right? Because you're used to thinking, okay, as little as possible, though I talk about this in part C on the rules for root position chords up on school.com/composition. In part C, I talk about exceptions to the rules, and I specifically mention the getting out of the deceptive cadence. I did not see this mentioned in the Alain Bernot or the Dubois. Maybe it's tucked away somewhere, but so some of these things that you just learn through your teacher, I've had to make accessible. So double check it, because that is really, really common, getting out of the deceptive cadence. You go to a 4 and the middle voice is going to leap. Now let's talk about the soprano. Let's talk specifically about leaps. So you may remember a recent video I did for the A minor soprano exercise that was modulating. And we had leaps of a fourth in a soprano. So we had A, D, and their principal notes of A minor. So when we first looked at the exercise, we thought it might be in C major, but then I suggested, well, why would we have these leaps A to D on the principal notes of A minor? Maybe we're in A minor, right? So 1, 4 is A, D, and A minor. Also, we said that B that didn't rise up to the tonic, which would be the tonic C. So we deduced maybe we're actually in A minor. However, here we also have a leap, Ré Sol, okay? But notice it's different circumstances in B minor. So in A minor, 1 to 4 is a D. But in B minor, that Ré Sol, D to G, is actually scaled degrees 3 to 6. So we thought, oh, it's a fourth of the fourth. I can apply. No. It's not that simple. That's why you gotta do the experience. You gotta drive the car. You can't just rely on intellectual knowledge. Now, another thing to notice is that the Ré Sol DG, that's leaping across a bar line, versus with the soprano exercise, we're leaping for the A minor, leaping within the bar. So those are two fundamentally different experiences, so they're not the same. So this is why you got to do the harmony exercises on a regular basis and write it out, because then you're going to notice the patterns. You won't, it's just intellectual otherwise. Spoiler alert, when you leap across a bar line, a big leap, many times you're going to a 4, many times, and this will persist all the way. Even when you do a 2 to seal with Mozart, you're like, what? How do I do this leap? Many times it's an indication of going to 4. It doesn't have to be, but many times. Now, one thing I want to mention is notice that we have a doubled third on that 4. So this is more advanced. This is something that Renaud, which I talked about, he does a lot. Okay, he will use, especially when you have a high soprano and elevated, you will have a doubled third. And one of the reasons to have to do that, the look with the alto is it's not gonna, if it jumps with the soprano, you take away some of that elegance. Now, sometimes that's fine, but here by doubling the third, I'm able to get really nice smooth voice sitting and have a really balanced chord, and creates a nice color. If you want absolute beginner exercises, then go directly to my website, barngmusic.com/fundamentals of harmony. You could start with the G minor exercise for the soprano. If you want something a little bit more advanced, if you're getting ready for orchestration and fugue, then go to school.com/composition, click on classroom, join for free. You'll also find the rules for root position chords at school.com/composition. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.